Welcome to the Mad Pastors Podcast, the honest podcast for honest pastors, powered by G6 Allies, because everybody needs an ally.
Welcome back to the Mad Pastors Podcast. I'm Ian Dunaway.
And I have returned
Michael's
from
back.
the dead, from beyond the grave. No, not really.
Dude, this is the first time we've talked and you haven't coughed at least 12 times in our talking.
I've cut it down to 6.
Okay.
8, maybe.
You sound like a smoker most of the time. Not there's anything wrong with smokers.
Just depends on what I'm smoking.
That's a good point. Listen, we are back and better than ever. In fact, if you're watching us right now, you can see us on YouTube. If you go to G6 Allies, to our YouTube channel, we will premiere live every week, and it's just going to get better and better and better. I know what you've been thinking. Is Ian really as good looking as he sounds? I think you have your answer. But, all right.
See, that's the benefit of doing video now, is I can mouth things to the camera to our viewers that the listeners aren't going to get.
We blur out hand gestures?
You know,
that might happen.
Now that I am back, I did bring with me a really cool studio, and we're able to do some video stuff.
We're live.
You
or
and
previously recorded, depending on when you watch this.
You and I have always been told that we have faces made for radio, and we are here to prove the masses wrong and say, look, we can be on video too. We're pretty.
I like to think of my face as working in multiple mediums, sometimes clay, other times oil paints. I'm just kidding. Either way. Listen, we are
thinking of you as in an oil painting. We don't need no video of that.
Paint me like one of your pretty girls, Jack.
Look at that. I've been back for a grand total of 60 seconds, and we've already gone off the rails.
Every Southern Baptist listen just cringe because I don't know if you're allowed to watch Titanic or not. It's okay, though. It was PG-13.
Oh, hey, let me say thank you to John John Oliver for guest hosting and filling in.
You better be listening to it, too.
Now. You did. I know he's listening. You did so much better than Ian gave you credit for. Yeah. So just want to say thank you. Appreciate what you did and filling in and helping out with the podcast. Great job, and look forward to having you back again.
Dude, it was super fun. Loved being with John and Ben. Comerford was great. We're gonna have him back soon. And so it's been really good. In fact, we're able to tell you that we're here in sunny Tulsa County, Oklahoma. And we're in our brand new video audio studio. So if you're thinking that it's a large and sprawling place, keep thinking that. But it's definitely...
That's what we want you to think.
Yeah, it looks bigger on video. But it's great because there's less echo and no problems. And I don't have to, we don't have to sit on your bedroom bed anymore and talk. And I'm just kidding. We never did that. But it's really cool. So we're here in studio live or pre-recorded, depending on when you watch this. But I'm excited. I'm ready to dive into a whole new series. So, we want to always thank our sponsor, Joy House Coffee, for taking care of us. Now we can do sweet product placement. But we're going to be doing a whole 4-podcast series on the whole idea of sports. I think Yogi Berra may have said it best when he says, if you don't know where you're going, you'll eventually end up somewhere else. And I think that... Yogi Berra. I think that really describes where so much of the church stands on a lot of issues, but especially sports. I think that we exist with it. We form opinions. I don't know if we think deeply about it. It just happens. And so I think we end up somewhere else when we really could be somewhere that we want to go. So we don't know where we're going with it. And so we're going to get to spend 4 podcasts talking through it. In fact, if you want to check out more about sports, Michael has written a book, and it's not new, but it's out there. And so it's called Well Played. And it is a Christian theology of sport and the ethics of doping. And so we're not necessarily talking about doping, though it may come up, but we're going to be talking about sports and theology and how those play together. Don't tune out, though. It's going to be very practical. It's going to be clear. It's going to be very biblical. And so with all of that said, Michael, you ready to dive in and get going?
Yep. So sport has always been one of the things I've loved most in life. In fact, I I loved it so much that I went and got a PhD in it, and that's where that book came from.
Yeah.
And I just loved it and was infatuated with it. And I could have told you every statistic about virtually any sport.
Dude, if there was fantasy curling, I feel like you would be.
I would have been in that. And so I remember when I was at school, we went to school in England, so our whole family moved over there, and there were several other students that were in a PhD program there as well, and we would have lots of conversations. Most of them are eggheads, right? They're book nerds, not super athletic, but we had a few that enjoyed sports, and they would ask me questions about just random, obscure. Hey, who holds the record for this, or what is this team's mascot? And they would try and stump me with these sports trivia questions, and I don't think they ever stumped me on a legitimate question that they asked me. I was so in love with sports, and I knew everything there was to know about every sport. Yeah. And so I was like, hey, I'm gonna do a PhD because I am pretty smart, and so I thought I'm gonna do a PhD in sport so that I can watch sport all the time and claim it as research.
True.
Which my supervisor also was a sports fan, and he thought the same thing. So we went to some football matches as research projects, and so I wasn't fooling Whitney for sure. I mean, my wife knew that. Okay, I see what game you're playing. I see what you're up to.
Across an ocean for you to watch more sports.
Yes, that's exactly what she would say. But at the end of the day, as I was researching sport and trying to come to grips with one of the major questions in sport of doping or performance enhancing drugs, genetic manipulation to make athletes faster, bigger, stronger, all of those things
that happen.
How do we think about that? Is that right? Is it wrong? What do we do? And the more I got into this, the more I realized that Christianity as a whole for 2,000 years has had very little to say about sports. Yeah. We don't think about it. We don't talk about it. We don't really even know how to incorporate sport into our theology.
Sure.
And that's a problem.
I think you just start an upward league. I think that's part of it.
Well, that's been about the extent of it, right?
Yeah.
Or we use it as an evangelism tool, But at the end of the day, we have to come to grips with it because it is so prevalent.
Mm-hmm.
So much money is spent on sports. So many people spend their time on sport. Sport is everywhere.
I could be wrong, but I want to say, so like I can't remember if we talked about this. I've done it from stage several times in church when I'm teaching, but the pornography industry is like the largest paid industry, one of the largest paid industries in the world. But then like second to that is usually sports. And sports is like an $11 billion a year, or maybe it was just football. $11 billion a year.
I think
that's massive.
I think it's probably quite a bit higher than 11.
I would imagine for all sports, but like just one alone is somewhere around like 11 billion. I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah. So it is so prevalent in our culture as pastors, particularly. I mean, theologians need to wrestle with some of the more philosophical stuff, which is what I do in that book. And so if you are philosophically averse and you don't want to get into that type of conversation, don't buy the book. Just listen to these podcasts and you'll be fine. But if you're interested in that, then for sure get it. But as pastors, we have to understand that probably 90+% of your people watch sport on a daily basis, if not for hours every day.
Yeah. Not to mix metaphors.
So how are we not thinking about this topic and how we need to apply it and use it? And because at the end of the day, what we end up thinking about sport as pastors is it's either, hey, this is just, it's just a trivial way of finding entertainment and we like to kill time by watching it on TV. Or we get mad at it because it pulls our people away from our worship services or from serving opportunities or, and becomes a competition thing with sport as a whole, right?
Or it does. I mean, I guess, as a pastor like you, it gets frustrating when people care more about a game that we'll forget about in 6 months and they care more about a game than if they'll argue with their neighbor about sports teams, but they won't ever share the gospel with them. And you're just, I think I don't even know if it's the pastors don't think about it. I think they don't know how to think. I think that's the problem. It's you only know what you know, and sometimes you only know how to do something if you're shown how to do it. Right. Like you can't even form. There's just so many things that I learned that the more I learn, the more I realize how little I know, and I just sit there and go, I don't even have a frame of reference for thinking through this. And I think that's what's so cool about these next 4 podcasts is that it's not even that you're telling everybody what to think about sports. You're giving them a frame of reference and an explanation of what God's word really does say and how it plays in, and it gives us the tools to start developing how we.
Yeah, and you're exactly right, and that's a great way of phrasing it. That we're creating a reference point for this, and I have, in whether it was teaching in a church setting and preaching, or whether it was in a classroom in college or master's level when I was teaching, I would always tell students and those who I'm teaching, my goal is not to teach you what to think. Right. My goal is to teach you how to think about it. And so that's what I want to do with sport. And that's the whole point of this book. And I want to help us as pastors learn how to think about this in a way that is helpful, in a way that's beneficial, in a way that leads us down a path of discipleship with our people. So maybe you're not a pastor and you're listening to this. There's some great stuff in here for you too. I'm just thinking about discipleship. And so here's how we kind of want this to flow. Okay. Most of us understand that there are many lessons that we can learn from sport. And that's one of the things that people like about it so much, is whether it's, character formation, or whether it's just like teamwork ideals, or there's all kinds of reasons that we like sport for the things that it can teach us. Right. Yeah. And so over the next 4 podcasts.
It is. I think probably 80% of all pastoral illustrations are sports.
Yes, we use a lot of them. Paul used them, right? Yeah. And we're running the race in such a way that you may win it, or boxing against the air. Paul uses sporting metaphors in the Bible. And
Let's take a break for the context of this, though. Those people were running naked. You were running naked through city to city. And what we now consider a crime and something fun to watch, that was just
celebrated then.
I'm not saying that we bring it back. I'm just telling you, it makes me even less likely to participate in sport. Here's the thing. I appreciate sport, and here's how I used to take it. I'm just not interested. Like, I love to watch college. I get irritated with pro sports because sometimes I go, these guys are babies and they give up and they're getting paid millions of dollars. But I love college sports. I enjoy watching them. I'm not ever going to read the statistics. I don't care. But I love to watch it. I enjoy seeing I love watching basketball be played and football. I even enjoy soccer. I just don't understand it. But it's, I used to tell students, we'll get into all this stuff, obviously, but just I am not a super sports guy. Doesn't mean I'm not a nerd. Doesn't mean I'm not athletic. I clearly don't have the body I used to. But I'm an athletic enough person. And I've enjoyed playing intramural and pickup and softball and things like that. I just am not huge in this. But I used to tell, I did ministry in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, which, if you ever have seen a college football game, the most obnoxious fans are Alabama Tide fans. They own it. I'm not saying anything that's going to offend anybody. They're just obnoxious, and they get worse the closer you get to the university. But, we would have football players or people come in at times and that kind of thing. And it was, I would just always tell them, and it's the same thing. I think sports has always been a really great tool to support students too. And to be able to show up at their games or talk to them. But when we were in college, that dominated everything everybody talked about. And I would just say, hey, I want you to know, you can always trust that I love you. And they'd say, why? What do you mean? And I'd say, because I just don't give a crap if you win or lose. I don't care. I said, I want you to win, don't get me wrong. But I said, but I don't care what happens, and I don't care who you are. And that should make you really happy.
I'm not going to lose any sleep if your team loses today.
Well, and I'm not going to treat you better or worse based on who you are, what you do. I just care about you. And, I don't know if that was necessarily the right aspect to take, but for me, it was like, you just need to understand, I appreciate sports. But as we talk through this, I'm going to have maybe, I don't know, more or less of an opinion of a guy who is maybe on the outside of a little bit of it, whereas you love to play and know everything about it. So I think it's a good dynamic.
One of the downsides of doing video podcasts is when you forget to plug in your laptop that's recording all of this, it gets caught on camera when I lean over to actually plug it in.
And if I say something inappropriate, you can't edit that out.
Oh dear, we're in trouble. I should have thought that through first. No, okay, so let's jump into this. That was a very long intro. That was almost a 15-minute intro into this.
It's a 4 podcast series.
it was helpful groundwork
Yeah.
for what we're going to jump into, and you made a good segue to it. I had to ruin it by plugging in my laptop, but
Well, you can only do what you can do. Other people have to help.
You gave an illustration of using sports as illustrations, that they're helpful tools for discipleship or for teaching or for showing people you care. And that's one of the views that has been adopted that the church has used. The primary one that we're familiar with.
Yeah, there's like three really.
And so there's three main views that the church has used throughout its 2,000-year existence to think about sport. And most of the time it's been, as I was doing research for my doctorate, it was pretty sparse finding, ancient resources that talk about, because it just wasn't much of an issue. And
Thomas Aquinas said, "Remember the footballer."
And he was one of the few that had anything to say about it at all.
Did he really?
Yeah, but
shoot from the hip.
But I mean, you can go all the way back to early church. Tertullian would talk about it, but beyond him, there wasn't much there.
Yeah.
But the three main views are this, and because I'm a pastor, I alliterated as I identified these views. I said the first view is that it's insignificant, and by that we simply mean there's no value to it at all. So why waste our time thinking about it or talking about it? Which is really where most people are today in practice.
Sure.
That I don't. It's not valuable whether a team wins or loses. It's insignificant. It's inconsequential. So why waste time thinking about it or focusing on it, right?
Does the insignificant, though, also, because so many people, more people than not, love sports, does that insignificant kind of play into us thinking about it as people just don't view it as being related to the church? Like, it's not even that doesn't hold value.
Yes.
It's just that, well, that doesn't. Those are two spheres that don't mix.
Right. Yeah. That's fair. I mean, there are a number of people that could not care less about sport in any capacity and have no care for it at all. I couldn't tell you how basketball is played. Don't care to know. I'm not going to waste my time on that. So for them, it's inconsequential,
right,
or insignificant. And then for others, like you're saying, I'll enjoy watching it every once in a while, but what has Jerusalem to do with Athens kind of a concept, right?
Sure.
That they never overlap, and so why waste time with it?
Right.
But that's one view, is that it's insignificant. The second view is that it's immoral, and the immoral view says that participating in sports is a sin, that you shouldn't be involved in it at all. And there are really two main reasons for this, and there are two groups that tended to look at things this way. The early church, like Tertullian, I mentioned him earlier, he for one fell into this camp and believed that participating in sports was immoral, and that it was something that was completely ungodly, that any Christ follower should never participate in.
He didn't have a basketball goal on his driveway.
And no, he did not. And for him, the reason was sport in his day was inextricably tied to pagan rituals and sacrifices.
Sure.
And so you couldn't participate in the Olympic Games or the Corinthian Games without participating in some form of pagan worship.
Which is fair.
And so that makes sense. And so he threw the baby out with the bathwater, essentially, and said any sport at all is evil, and Christians ought to stay away from it.
Right.
More recently, in the 1800s with the Puritans, they also found it to be immoral, but that was because they were so heavily focused on work and productivity, and that rest or any kind of leisure was wrong, because you're wasting valuable time that God has given you to do stuff. And so if you're out playing a game, that's time you should be spending serving the Lord and doing things for the Lord. And so if you're playing a game, you're not doing what God has called you to do, and so it's immoral. Which is,
if you make that a little less extreme, like we were talking about earlier, a lot of people, at least more fundamentalist groups, fall more into that category too. I mean, it's not quite as overboard, but
right. I mean, there's definitely some echoes of that in there. That hey, you went to that sporting event when you should have come to my Bible study, kind of a thing.
You've only been to 4 Bible studies this week.
Yeah, and you've watched 16 basketball games. So There is some of that in here too, but I don't think that's an accurate view. And I don't remember if I mentioned this, but I don't think any of these three views that the church has traditionally held are accurate. I think we need to think differently about it.
So we're going to talk about three inaccurate views and not talk about the most accurate?
Correct.
Way to set us up for 4 weeks.
That's right. I'm going to keep you on the hook for 4 weeks.
I think the last one, though, that you're going to talk about is probably, as we talked about as we were looking at this content, because this is, normally we're, you're driving this whole thing for 4 podcasts, which is great. Because this is your field of expertise for sure. But I'm looking at all this kind of fresh too and getting challenged too. And I think this third one we talked about, this is how, you had mentioned most people view it this way. Then you called me out on it like a jerk. And so, but I think that, you said sports as instrumental, right? As this third view. And I think that is where myself and 95.7% of pastors fall.
Probably higher.
Probably 99.9%, and you're that 0.1. But that is in that. But in that, I know we need to talk about it before I say this, but in that, well, actually, you talk about it, and then I want to.
Let's explain what we mean by instrumental.
Hey, what do you mean by instrumental?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Ian. What we mean by instrumental is that sport is neither inherently good or bad. It is simply a thing that exists.
It's like social media.
And then you can, maybe.
There's arguments both ways. I'm sorry, just throw it out.
And then you can use it as a tool,
right,
for good or for bad, right?
It's just morally neutral.
It is completely neutral.
It's a shovel.
And it's,
do I want to dig with it or kill somebody with it?
That went dark. But as
if you tell your kids
as an instrument, it can be used for character formation. It can be used as an evangelism tool. It can be used as a form of exercise. It can be used as different things. But in and of itself, it's not really got any weight or merit to it. It's how you use it.
And here's what is interesting to me. When you say, I'm going back thinking through everything, or all the things that I've been a part of at church when it came to sports and really using it in an instrumental way. But to me, one thing that I think of, we had a church with a big sports program. They had a whole ministry. I've served several churches that way, but one that was served at where, they did upward, and it's not upwards, it's upward. But they did upward programs, which I got my own problems with because I think that is a participation trophy culture where it's like nobody wins or loses. Well, then you're going to really have a hard time in school and life. But that coffee's coming up. All that to say, it's interesting because I think when we think about something like that, it doesn't have to be just sports. It can be about anything else. But when we try and hijack something as an instrument, quote unquote, it tends to devalue both the gospel and that thing. And like one example, we had all these big football fields out of this church, and the guy that ran the program had no business doing anything in ministry. He barely had business doing anything with people, but he would run this whole this event, and he would say, okay, we need to do, and everybody was fine with it except for anybody that was asked to do these devotionals. But at halftime, they shut everybody down, and then he would have a pastor get up and talk and speak out like this Devo in front of everybody for like 5 minutes. It's incredibly weird and awkward, and nobody paid attention to you. And I just remember thinking how crazy it was because 0 pastors ever wanted to help do it on staff because of how weird and awkward it was. But everybody felt like, well, we got to add something about Jesus in there. And then also they had to do something, but we got to use sports. And it seemed to devalue both of them. Mm-hmm. And when we look at the gospel should, and following Christ should inhabit the things that we do, not simply use them or not simply be connected to them. And I don't know. I see that a lot. I see upward, something like upward, where God's word says nothing about. God's word is actually kind of opposite of that, where it's don't keep score, don't ever win or lose, don't ever, that doesn't really seem like God's word, but we do it to make people happy, or we use it to draw in crowds, or we throw in these random, devos that really could be classified just as Aesop's fables.
When you look at sport as an instrument, for something else, it inherently loses value, right?
Sure.
Because it's a means to an end, and the end is what you're focused on.
And that's not
And
how
so-
Jesus used things like that. Jesus, if something
No.
had value, there was a way he would take it, treat it as valuable, and then show how the gospel
And so
worked into that.
we will we'll come back to mention each of these views over the next couple of podcasts.
Sure.
But I want to say at the front end of the rest of the 4 episodes that each of these 3 views has some good merit to them, and we can easily identify with each of them. Like, oh yeah, I know people that think it's insignificant. I know people that think it's immoral, and I know people who use it as an instrument. But I think all 3 of them fall short of the way we ought to be thinking about sport. And so we'll spend the next several weeks getting into that and what that looks like. But for the rest of today's podcast, I want us to look at a couple of the lessons that sport teaches us.
Okay.
And so in terms of morality or conversations around ethics, which was the primary driver behind my dissertation in this book, we learn a couple of lessons. We have a couple of really interesting conversations, ethical conversations about sport. And I want to touch on those, but I also want us to see how those lessons that we learn in sport, we can actually apply them and use them in terms of discipleship.
Oh, yeah.
How they make a difference. What we learn about sport, what that teaches us, and how that informs our approach to discipleship. And so I got 3 topics or areas I want us to focus on for the rest of today. One of those, the first is where sport and faith intersect with competition. One of the big ethical questions, particularly
the best wins.
with Christians, is competition a biblical concept? Is it a Christian concept, a concept that Christians can stand behind?
Sure.
How does that intersect? If it's about competing and it's about me winning, how does that relate to verses that talk about putting others first or turning the other cheek? Or is there some disconnect between these two? And can Christians actually participate in this, or is it just promoting selfishness?
It's a solid point, because we run into that all the time, right? When I was chaplain on a football team or a basketball team, I always felt weird, and I don't even know if I knew, other than to just say, hey, I'm going to pray that you glorify God in how you act, but I'm not going to pray that you beat the other team, because they're praying too for that, and that's not really, I don't know if I approach that right, but I just think that it's always funny, because like the 2 Christian schools are like, God, just help us to vanquish the enemy in Jesus' name. Philippians 4:13 says I can beat that kid's butt, and it's just like, all right, hold on. How do we approach that?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
That's even more pointed than you telling your students in Tuscaloosa that you don't care if they win or not.
Yeah.
Try telling them God doesn't care if their team wins or not, and see how that goes for you.
Doesn't go. Well. I was never asked to be a chaplain.
But here's the thing with competition, and as we think about it in terms of sport, one way we can quickly address that issue is to think about the difference between a mentality in competition that's a win at all costs mentality that says, I'm going to do whatever I have to win. If that means I have to cheat, I'm going to cheat because I have to win. I have to be first, and I'm going to hope that you break your leg in the middle of that race. I'm going to hope you get injured, or the other team's best player gets injured and can't play, and that improves our chances of winning. And we go down some dark paths trying to get to the point where we will do anything and we'll be happy with anything that lets us win, right?
Think about Will Ferrell and Kicking and Screaming. When he has his kid's soccer team, he goes, all right, break your clavicle on 3.
Yes. Right. That kind of mentality, there's something corrupt in competition when that becomes our approach. But healthy competition is something I think Christians can stand behind. And healthy competition is when 2 individuals or 2 teams, they mutually submit together to participate in that game on the same playing field, pun intended, right? That they are mutually submitting to this idea of, hey, you're going to do your best, I'm going to do my best, and we're going to see who comes out on top. And at the end of the day, we're going to shake hands and we're both going to walk away, one victorious, one not so much, right? That's healthy.
Yeah, no doubt.
And so I want us to apply that same idea to our discipleship. One, I think we get into trouble when it becomes all about me.
Right.
And we play the comparison game, and we hope that, that other person fails, or that God doesn't bless them as much as, because he's not blessing me. So why are they getting this stuff?
We just feel it.
Oh yeah, we think it.
We're too smart to say it.
But why, God, you're not giving me the stuff. Why are you giving it to them? I don't want them to have it. If I can't have it, they can't have it either. Mm-hmm. That's corrupted. There's a problem with that. But where discipleship can take a cue from healthy competition is in that mutual submission.
Yeah.
You and I are working together to accomplish a goal, which is to become more like Christ. Mm-hmm. And good discipleship requires that we have others present to help us do that.
Oh, yeah,
that I do my best, you do your best, and we sharpen one another. And that's Proverbs 27:17, right? That as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. That is healthy.
We need one another to spur each other on.
Yes. And so that's a really healthy concept of competition within a Christian framework. So no, I don't think Christians have this, should have this inherent hatred for competition as something non-biblical, because competition is not just about me winning, and it's not a selfish ideal. In fact, Paul says in Corinthians 9, that run your race in such a way that you may win it. Mm-hmm. Paul is striving you to win. There's no participation trophies in the Bible. You need to win. And so work as if you are going to win the prize. Sure. Just like athletes in a race, they're going to run to win. You need to be doing the same thing, Paul says. So competition is not inherently wrong, but like so many things, we corrupt it and we make it about our selfish gain at the expense of others.
But is the confusion, so as I hear you talk about this, I'm thinking through it, it seems to be largely, though, is the confusion on what winning and development really mean, right? So you're right. You have a win at all cost team, we have probably one of the most myopic cultures in the last 2,000 years, right? Because we now have entire feeds and social channels and all that set up to ourselves. But like when we begin to look at it, it all comes down to what is victory to us, right? Like, man, what is winning? Is winning I get to take home the prize at the end, which very easily becomes this. But that's not how God views discipleship and views growth. And I don't think that's how, like you said, healthy competition should be viewed. Right. It's not always about walking away with the trophy, though we want it, and we should want it, the same way that in James, when he talks about living steadfastly, which would contrast with Paul's Corinthians 9, this idea that, man, I want to run this race well so I get the crown, so that I catch the award. But I think to me, it's almost to this point where if all we want is our view of what winning is, then we'll never understand the growth in the process. And discipleship is about growth in the process. I don't know. I've trained more student leaders, I told you this the other day, and more church volunteers off of Hoosiers and the movie Miracle. These are just great. Mm-hmm. But I think one of the greatest for teams and for discipleship and all that, we tend to look for the best people. We want the best. And the interesting thing throughout Scripture is that God never uses the best people. And so, you're watching this with Herb, the coach in Miracle, and they had a week-long set of tryouts, which it's one of the driest movies ever, but it's one of my favorites, is Miracle. I love it. But I love it when he says, "Hey, Herb, you already got your roster?" He goes, "These aren't even the best players." And he always has that real northern accent. He says, "I'm not looking for the best players. I'm looking for the right ones." Mm-hmm. And I sit there and think the same thing with us. If we look at our discipleship, are we simply trying to find the best, or are we looking for what's right? And I don't know. I think one thing that's not right is wasting our time reading mediocre books. Don't you?
That sounds like a segue.
Perhaps it is. And here's what I want. I want people to stop wasting the little time that you have reading mediocre books. There isn't enough time in your day for work and ministry, family, whatever it may be, plus countless hours that you have to use to mine mountains of books and resources just hoping to find a few nuggets of gold. So listen, make an investment in yourself that will pay dividends for you and those around you. I'm talking about GrowBox. GrowBox includes reading plans and practical guides that help you get the most out of each book. So you won't just read great books, you will engage with them. Every book we've gone through has been vetted to ensure that you never waste time on bad books again. That's a huge promise and one that we can very confidently give you. But you aren't the only one that benefits from Grow Box. Every Grow Box includes a bag of delicious coffee from a mission-minded business that sustains farms in Haiti and helps invest in people. Plus, who said growth should be boring? Every quarter that we send you out a Grow Box, you'll receive a free, unique, fun, practical gift that's just plain cool, and it's guaranteed to make you at least 60% cooler in your office. Every single Grow Box, 60% of the time, it works every time. Every Grow Box is assembled by our team with resources specifically for you. Listen, there's no one size fits all for growth, and there shouldn't be. And that's why we've actually made personal growth personal, not again, but I think for the first time. And so growth should be challenging, shouldn't be impossible. And that's why we cannot recommend Grow Box for you enough. Listen, we've been kicking them out and shipping them out, and we've had great responses so far. You need to make this investment in yourself. It is literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars worth of coaching put in a box for a very low price every quarter. Here's the thing. You're not going to grow if you don't make an investment. And so it's time to make an investment. Jump in with us. All right.
Yeah.
Michael.
Awesome.
Segue complete.
Okay. Segue complete. So let's take, we got about 10 minutes or so left, and let's talk about the other two topics that when we think about lessons that sport teaches us in terms of morality.
We just did competition.
So we talked about competition.
Yep.
Now let's talk about the human body.
Mm-hmm.
So when we think about sport and the body, and academically, there's a lot of resources on the body, and theologically, what does the body mean, and what's its significance, what's its value?
There's a lot in the Bible about the body.
The Imago Dei and being made in the image of God. There's a lot of stuff there. Yeah. But I want to be real practical in terms of sport, and so I see two extremes that happen when we think about the body in sport. One is pure body worship, that we idolize the physical attributes and the physical qualities and the performance factor of our physical bodies, and what we can do, how fast we can run, or how far we can hit a golf ball, or we look at that side of it and we worship
the Sports Illustrated body issue,
the body issue, ESPN's body issue, and it's an entire quarterly issue or semi-annually issue that is completely dedicated to showing as much of a professional athlete's body as they possibly can. And it's because they're just worshiping the muscle tone and the structure and the body shape of professional athletes. And so there's this worship of who we are physically. And then the other side of it, the other moral challenge that we see in sport is literally the exact opposite of that we don't value the body at all. Right. Like, we subject the body to brutal punishment, whether it's UFC fighting or boxing or your full contact sports like football, and strides have been made to combat some of this, some of the concussion studies that the NFL has done, some of the rules they have put into place. And even at that, most average viewers hate the new rules because they've taken away, the targeting rules have completely ruined the game of football, or,
they keep watching.
Yeah, so keep watching, but we want it to be as hard hitting and as brutal as we can. How do we as Christians reconcile that with the idea that we are created in God's image and our bodies are to be valued? UFC does not value our bodies, right? It's, I'm going to beat you to the pulp and you beat me to the pulp, and whichever one of us is still standing wins. Yeah. And so how do we as Christians reconcile the ethics of these two pieces?
Well, it's funny too, because we only like other people getting their body. I mean, this is a side note. I don't know how deep it is, but it's just funny that we don't tend to care about other people getting wrecked. We don't want to get wrecked.
Yeah. Unless it's like, I remember in I think it was late 90s, early 2000s, when Mike Tyson was making his comeback, and whoever the guy was that they got to fight against him. I'm a big boxing fan. Whoever it was they got to put in the ring with Mike Tyson,
right,
was guaranteed $2 million
Oh, I thought
even in a loss. And I was like, sign me up. I will take a hit from Mike Tyson if it means
one hit,
a couple million. Yeah, that's all it would take.
He would
look at me and I would fall to the mat dead.
Yeah.
But, unless it's that, no, we don't want to be the one, but we want to watch other people do it. And so there's also an issue there of spectating
what kind of sadist?
something bad. So there's lots of stuff to think through about on a philosophical, theological level, but I promise to stay practical. And so here's how I want us to think about those two concepts in terms of discipleship.
Right.
Those two things matter because in terms of our spiritual formation and our spiritual growth, we tend to do the same thing as we do in sports. We either worship the image, we either idolize the physical, we're completely vain, and we have to look perfect, or we like to look at people who look perfect.
Sure.
And so that's one
number of workout
fault.
Selfies you see every day.
Yeah, that's one fault.
Yeah.
And the other fault at the other extreme is the same way. We don't value our bodies at all. We're workaholics. We run ourselves in the ground. We don't eat healthily. We don't take care of ourselves. We don't rest. There is no care for our physical bodies at all. And we tend to go to one of two extremes.
And you don't even have to be in sports for that, both of those extremes.
Not at all. Not at all. And that's where I think discipleship, if we're going to understand discipleship, it means we have a good, balanced understanding of our bodies. And that, no, we're not idolizing our physical appearance, but neither are we completely ignoring our physical bodies and just letting them degrade. Like we're striking a balance. Real discipleship requires that we do that. You cannot be a growing, maturing disciple if you're completely obsessed with the physical appearance and with vanity, nor can you be a good, maturing and growing disciple if you never take care of yourself.
Sure.
And they're mutually exclusive. So as disciples, one of the things that a conversation about sport helps us to understand is to think about what we do with our bodies, and as Christ followers, how that applies and what that means.
And one thing too, I think to go along with that, so this is not even sports, but just in general, is that taking that best mentality, best versus the journey and best versus right. We tend to think if somebody's skinny, then they must be taking care of their body, or if somebody is, if they're overweight or fat or whatever we would call them, then they must not be. And, one thing that I've been challenged on, I know what you're thinking. I'm chiseled. Now on video, you can see that's a joke. But either way, I've been through a pretty crazy health journey in the last, 5 or 6 years, and have met more and more people that are. And I think one interesting thing to know is not that we shouldn't judge for ourselves something that's going on or seeing it, but to have a lot of grace in that it's a matter of being on the journey of actually being a healthy person. Because, my wife is more thin on the outside, fat on the inside, where she eats like a middle schooler. I teach her all the time. She eats like a middle school boy. And I'm like, Hannah, you might die by the age of 40. And she's like, it's okay. Twinkies are good. But she never seems to get it. And so we laugh back and forth, because if I smell a Twinkie, I gain like 5 pounds. And so some of it, it's a big deal not to just focus on comparing and being like somebody else, but also understanding that the people that you're around and yourself, it's about a journey of God working in you and making you a healthier person. And some people, listen, I'm never going to be Chris Hemsworth. All right. We all know this, but I'm not working towards that. I want to be the healthy person I was designed to be. Right. And I don't know. I think that fits a little bit into what we're talking about, but it's about
Paul
having some grace there.
And we're gonna ignore the fact that you said your wife is fat on the inside. That is not something that you should ever say.
She doesn't even
ever.
This. But she's not. She's
but
on the outside. It's tofu. It's a real
But
thing.
anyway, Paul says in 1 Timothy 4:8, he says that for the training of the physical body is of some value, but really focus on growing spiritually, right? And so we tend to, especially when we preach on that, we go right to the spiritual side. See, Paul says you should be growing spiritually. Mm-hmm. But implicit in what Paul is saying is that there is value in taking care of your physical body.
Yeah.
We ought to be doing that. There's a mandate in the Bible for us taking care of ourselves physically.
Yeah.
But the other extreme of that we need to avoid, people go to the verse in 1 Corinthians 6 where Paul says, don't you know that your body is a temple?
Right.
And so, we ought never eat anything unhealthy. We need to exercise 6 hours a day. And if you're not doing that, you're not treating your body as a temple. And well, okay, let's just press pause and think hermeneutically about that. He's talking about temple worship through the act of sex, right? He's not talking about being healthy and how many burpees you did and that kind of stuff. But we need to avoid those two extremes. And so good discipleship avoids those two extremes, and we land somewhere in the middle of yes, we ought to be taking care of ourselves, but don't let vanity overtake that.
Well, healthy growth and all of that. I would say this for people with grow box, and we'll say at the end, but if you can't define growth, then the odds are you're not growing, because it's an intentional thing. But I think that when we talk about
Yogi's quote.
Say what?
Yogi's quote.
That's right.
If you don't know where you're going,
you'll end up somewhere else.
You'll end up somewhere else.
But I think what you hit is a really important place, because it doesn't matter if it's theologically, it doesn't matter if it's sports, it doesn't matter if it's discipleship, that there is a biblical precedence all throughout Scripture for balance, because balance keeps us humble. Balance allows us to understand that nobody is 100. It keeps us from idolatry. Nobody's 100% right or 100% wrong. That the only person that is God, and that our interpretation of God's word is not that 100%. And so, even as we look at this idea that if we're not balanced people, we don't tend to be very Christ-like people, right? I mean, either way.
So, all right, let's talk about the last piece of this that I want to talk about, where sport and faith intersect with obsession. I'm not talking about the perfume in their perfume or cologne or something called obsession.
You spend a lot more time in the cologne counters than me. I'm still using Axe body spray. So
when we think about sport, and I think I mentioned this at the beginning, the amount of time and the amount of money that is spent in sport, there's an ethical question there. So, for instance, the billions of dollars that make up the sporting industry.
Sure.
If we took the billions of dollars that we spend on that and invested that money in sustainable food sources, we could eliminate world hunger.
Right.
So the fact that we're not doing that instead of eliminating world hunger, we're spending our money on games.
Or developing nations.
What's wrong here?
Yeah.
And so that's an ethical discussion to be had in the world of sport, or the countless hours that are spent participating and watching and preparing and training, and all of the time that we spend on that is time that we could be spent elsewhere. That was kind of the immoral view of the Puritans.
Yeah.
Richard Baxter, they're like, you're wasting your time. We have a limited amount of time, and God has given us a mission. And anytime you're spending on that is time you're not spending doing what God's called you to do. So there's definitely questions around that. And I think the point of application for discipleship is pretty clear. Being a good disciple means that we are good with our time and with our money.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I get the frustration of pastors and of disciple makers who look at people who spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars on sporting events or on equipment or league registrations for their kids, but never are generous outside of that. They don't even tithe. Don't tithe. They don't, not even, and because I'm hesitant to use that kind of language as a pastor because I don't want it to sound self-serving, but just being a generous person in general. They're not generous at all, but they'll spend thousands of dollars on sporting activities.
Right.
Or they will spend, 10 to 15 hours a week watching SportsCenter or watching the football games. But man, I'm too busy. I don't even have time to read my Bible for 10 minutes a day. Right? Like there's a very clear imbalance here, and being a good disciple means that we understand how to regulate this. So
and you can see both of the. So one of the things we were talking about, and this is so, especially spending the vast majority of my time in student ministry and working with parents and with students, what has always been difficult for me, I wasn't irritated that people had seasons and they would say, you know what, we're going to be gone for 4 or 5, these 6 weeks, we won't be here, but we're connecting, listening, and they would stay in touch. But what tends to bother me in general, and it happens always, is it's a connection of sports as a tool and as instrumental, and then sports also as, well, I don't know if it's insignificant. Maybe it's moral. But those things kind of mix to where it becomes one of these things where they go, well, you start seeing more and more posts. Parents won't get their kids to come to student ministry or to go to church at all. And they either push them or they have, they say, well, I don't push them. They want to. Well, yeah, but they've also been conditioned in the house to want this. And then they'll start talking about how coaches are their kids' disciple. Well, no, that's not true. And they need balance too. Coaches can disciple, but coaches aren't pastors. And pastors aren't coaches. And I mean, these are all different. I mean, we all are in different places.
And it's also, if your kid said, the example you just gave of, well, we're not pushing them. They want to do this.
Right.
If your kid just wanted to go sit on the street corner and smoke pot, he wants to do this. I guess I'm just going to let him.
Yeah.
Right. No, there's some parenting that's involved here.
And we
let's teach your kid what to value and what priorities look like.
No doubt. And that was always something that we'd run into. And this is a general thing that can go off on its own tangent, but I won't. But either way, though, it's always that statement of, they go, well, I don't want to force Jesus on my kids because I want them to choose. Well, you don't do that with sports. You don't do it with school. You don't do it with anything else. You're just lazy and not growing yourself. And that is, but here's the thing. I think sports often is used because it is so all-encompassing. It does pull us in, that I do think we have to be careful to let one do the other's job. And I think that you can't treat sports like it's immoral and say never do sport, because we are designed and hardwired to compete and to enjoy these things. On the other side of it, I think people need to be very careful, because we see this more and more and more, that we tend to merge it and pretend like the sports arena can fulfill the church. Well, we get together and we have a prayer time before our softball games. Well, good, but you don't fellowship with the people of Jesus, and you're not studying God's word. And so, but that has a lot to do with how shallow our culture is too. So all that to say, I don't know, man, I'm excited for this series. I think it's going to be a really good one.
So by way of quick recap, and as you're listening to this and you're thinking through, how do I engage sport, and what do I think about it? I think we ought to consider that there are some parallels in how we view sport and how we view discipleship.
Yeah.
And that's the main takeaway of today's. One, that discipleship requires a mutual submission with others, and we're encouraging and challenging one another to get better. Mm-hmm. Just like with sport competition, I want to compete. When I was doing competitive sports, I wanted to compete against the best.
Yeah.
Because if I beat them, then I knew I was the best.
When I was playing NCAA 2008, I wanted to compete against the best.
So I was a runner, and so track and field was my thing. And so we would have some meets where just by nature of which schools were involved, there wasn't any competition there for me. Right. And I would win the race easily, and people would congratulate me for winning, and I felt like the whole thing was worthless because there was no challenge. I didn't have anybody that I could mutually submit with to get me to where I needed to go, and felt like I was really growing in my craft. Yeah. I think discipleship works the same way. Sure. And so we need to come alongside others that are actually going to challenge us and going to help us get to where we want to go. And so
take those same principles you desire in athletics
and apply them right here. So competition is one, how we view our physical bodies. It's not something that we idolize or worship, but it's also not something that we completely ignore. Like there's a middle balance that we need to strike in how we approach our physical beings and focus on that some as a means to growing spiritually as well, right? Yeah. And then third is, as a good disciple, we're paying attention to the imbalance of where our time and our money is going, and making sure that we're prioritizing the things of God in that as well. We don't completely cut out sports or other things that we're spending time and money on. That's well and good, but we also don't ignore the things of God so that we have more to spend on other things, right?
No doubt.
Hopefully this has been helpful, and I hope you're excited about the next couple of ones. Yeah. The next few are going to be really interesting, and we'll get more into some of that point of reference idea that we were talking about, and how we can start thinking about sport and use that as we're teaching our people, as we're leading our families, wherever your situation is, there's some really interesting and helpful things for us to learn.
Sports isn't going anywhere, and nor should it. But the church needs to be good at addressing it. Take some time just to think about, what do you tend to think about sports as immoral or as insignificant or as instrumental in your lives? And do us a quick favor. Not only do you need to subscribe to the podcast, whatever venue you're listening to it on, but
YouTube.
You need to go to YouTube and click that subscribe button. I don't care if you like us or not. Click it because you need to hear what we got going on. And G6 Allies is a lot more than just a podcast, all right? I'm not even saying just because it isn't significant, but we got a lot of cool stuff that is coming and being developed and happening, and you need to be a part of it. So, guys, thanks for joining us. Michael, I'm glad you're back.
Good to be back. And if you guys have questions on any of this stuff, as always,
comment below.
Comment on the post or email us at the email address you're about to get in the post credit.
That's a win. All right. Well, talk to y'all soon.
Thank you for listening to the Mad Pastors podcast today. We hope that you found it not only encouraging, but beneficial that you have people in your corner doing ministry. Here's what we'd love for you to do. If you'd subscribe, review, and share our podcast, that would mean the world to us, and it'd help as many pastors to hear and be encouraged just like you were. G6 is also supported by partners and allies like you who are willing to financially give and be a part of this ministry with us. So if you feel like you'd like to be a part of this with us, just go to g6allies.com/partner, and we'd love for you to become our ally in our mission to serve pastors and their families. If you have questions, comments, or just want to talk more with us about your particular ministry needs, just email us at hello@g6allies.com. We can't wait to see you next time for our next episode.